1951. And things are once again settling out. Look who the top three are. Look who the bottom three are. Detroit, they lead the way. They get the President's Trophy that year. It's a jinx. 44-13-13 is their record. Toronto's next at 41-16-13. And that's it for teams above 500. So very dominant performances by both the Detroit Red Wings and Toronto Maple Leafs. Does it continue into the playoffs? We'll see. Montreal's next at 25-30-15. That's right, only two teams were over 500 that year. You know, when I'm writing this down, it makes me miss when teams were below 500. To me, this looks like a much more honest record than what we see now. We'll see a team with 90 points, and we go, they had a really crappy year. And it still doesn't sit well with me that a team can be above 500 and still lose more games than they won. Baffled. Boston 22-30-18. The Rangers 20-29-21. And then there's Chicago. And no amount of overtime wins would have got them over 500. It's a dark time for Chicago. They need Bobby Hull. That's who they need. They need Bobby Hull. And that's still a ways out. Detroit, Gordie Howe is now officially a megastar. With about 75, I think it was 75 points. He set a record for right wingers. He ends up with 86 points, which sets a new NHL record, beating out the record of Kane, who had that record before. And why isn't he in the Hall? He won the scoring title, and he was the number one point producer in NHL history for a while, between when Kane was the leading scorer and now, and he's not in the Hall. It's so weird to me. Terry Sawchuk comes in as a rookie and sets a mark he'll never reach again, so that always feels good. He gets 44 wins, a record that stood until 2007. It's 2007 that Berger beat it, and Luongo got past it as well. And to me, again, coming back to records, to me the Sawchuk record stands because there were no overtimes involved. There were no shootouts involved. So to me, the Sawchuk record of 44 wins is still the mark. But that's me. Turk Broda ends up being the first goalie to reach 300 wins on December 20th, 1950, but he's starting to lose his job in Toronto. And there were rumblings the year before this that Turk Broda's weight was a problem. And they actually pulled 4 Maple Leafs out of the lineup due to media talking about these guys having a weight problem. I think Toronto media is bad now. It's always been bad. March 31st, 1951, a playoff game between the Toronto Maple Leafs and Boston Bruins is ruled a tie. Why? There's a curfew. You aren't allowed in the city of Toronto to start an overtime period after midnight. Gotta go home. Can you imagine if that happened now? You imagine if you're through double overtime and then all of a sudden the PA announcer comes on, due to lateness, game's over. Good night, everybody. Oh wow, that'd be, and yet, do you know what's funny about that? There are people who would say that's fine. There are people who don't like the really long overtime games, and they'd be perfectly fine with a game being considered a draw, move on to the next one. And it would be chaos. Absolute chaos. If you instituted ties in overtime or in playoffs. It won't happen. It won't. But it would be a chaotic situation if we went to a possibility of, let's say a team wins 2 games in a series and wins the series because they lost one and then there were 4 ties in there. It would be chaos. It really would. Bill Barolko of these guys ended up scoring the Stanley Cup winner to give them 4 Stanley Cups in 5 years, furthering that dynasty. But Barolko would die in a plane crash that summer. And that definitely puts a damper on things, and it would be I'm just thinking ahead here. I don't think Toronto wins another one in the 50s. Maybe they do. I know we've got a dynasty on the way in these guys, and I know Detroit's got some wins in them as well. So it's one of those things that it's sad to see. It does happen in the game. There are plenty of occasions where a player will, encounter that. Of course, from a Vancouver perspective, Luc Bourdon's the name that comes to mind. And you never know what might have happened, how much further would the career have gone, and whatnot. And for Barocco, it's one of those ultimate examples because the guy does score the game-winning goal as a defenseman in overtime for a team that's a dynasty. And yeah, the Hart Trophy that year goes to Milt Schmidt of the Boston Bruins. The Art Ross Trophy goes to Gordie Howe of the Detroit Red Wings. The Calder Trophy goes to Terry Sawchuk of Detroit because of course it does. The Vezina goes to Al Rollins of the Toronto Maple Leafs. So Rollins is taking over as the goaltender ahead of Turk Broda. Rollins gets 27 of those 41 wins. The other 14 go to Broda. So Rollins is getting the lion's share of games. Red Kelly gets the Lady Bing for the Detroit Red Wings. The playoffs, the semifinals, Montreal and Detroit. Of course, Montreal below 500. Detroit 44 wins. This should be an easy win for Detroit. Nope. Montreal goes in and beats Detroit twice. The first game is 3-2 in 4 overtimes. The second game is 1-0 in 3 overtimes. Games 3 and 4, however, both go Detroit's way in Montreal. First game 2-0. Second game 4-2. Series is tied at 2. Montreal wins in Detroit 5-2. No team has won at home in this series until Game 6, when Montreal closes it out with a 3-2 win. Which, of course, Montreal is viewed as one of the greatest playoff teams, if not the greatest playoff team of all time. And we'll get into those dynasties that really do make it so there's not a whole lot of argument about it. Unless you're looking at it from now and, they only had a 6-team league. Whatever. Then these teams have a lot to answer for, don't they? In this series, of course, Boston wins in Toronto 2-0. Game 2, it's tied at 1 after 1 overtime, and they call the game. If Boston wins this game, who knows, but they didn't. Toronto wins both games in Boston 3-0 and then 3-1. Toronto wins at home 4-1 and then destroys Boston in Game 6. 6-0 to win the series, 4 wins, 1 loss, 1 tie. The official scoreline is they won the series 4-1, but let's be honest, it was 4-1-1. And then in the finals, every game goes to overtime. This is the only time this has ever happened. And it shows how evenly matched Toronto and Montreal were, despite the fact that their records indicated they weren't that evenly matched. Toronto wins Game 1 3-2. They lose Game 2 at home 3-2, but they win Games 3 and 4 on the road 2-1 and 3-2. So Montreal comes out of these playoffs with a 1-4 record. So their intimidation factor that they had at home, they don't have that yet. And then in Game 5, they go into Toronto, and Toronto wins that one. Also, of course, in overtime, 3-2. Toronto wins the series in 5, but with all those overtimes, more like 6. And you can look at puck luck, but Montreal's going to make up for that with an overtime run by Patrick Roy about a month from now in this series. Anyways, there you go. We're still in the original 6 era. For people who are wondering, I'm going to do this all the way up until last season. But for right now, it's still the original 6. Detroit, Montreal, and Toronto are the top 3 teams. And Toronto wins their 4th Stanley Cup in 5 seasons. It's a dynasty. There's no arguing about that. And there are more dynasties yet to come. So we'll get into those in the coming days. But for today, it's Toronto Day. Thank you so much for watching. Hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video. I'll talk to you again soon.